Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis-a-Famille History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis-a-Famille History with your host, Wendy Aris. Today, we've got a fantastic episode lined up. Wendy will be sitting down with Sylvia Cowenberg, is Professor of Linguistics and Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, the University of the West Indies, Mona Campus. Her research in Creole linguistics focuses on formal grammar and the historical processes and social context of Creole genesis of Berbice Dutch, Papiamento, and Jamaican Creole. In this episode, they'll be diving into a topic that's both personal and powerful: the typology of Caribbean Creole reduplication. So settle in, and let's get into the conversation.
Professor Cowenberg, for coming on to the podcast, Dis-a-Famille History, to speak about your paper in regards to reduplication of the Caribbean Creole languages. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
So, Sylvia Cowenberg, I pursued study of linguistics at the University of Amsterdam in the 1980s. And I was fortunate that there were people in the Department of General Linguistics there who took a great interest in Caribbean Creole languages. And so that was my introduction to the study of Caribbean Creole languages. And it appealed to me because I had learned to speak Papiamento. Mm-hmm. And I knew a good bit of Suriname Tongo as well. So with that background, it was really amazing to me to see how these languages were studied in a really serious way by linguists. And that, the knowledge that one has intuitively of a language that you speak can be made visible and conscious and described and made sense of. And of course, there was never a question in my mind that Caribbean Creole languages, full languages with grammars. It's really not until I, came to the Caribbean that I realized how much prejudice there is towards these languages and how many people believe, are quite convinced that the language of their environment is in fact a broken language and not a full language. So that is problematic. Mm-hmm. And so some of the work I have done at UWI, where I was first appointed in 1991 on the Mona campus in Jamaica, has been to try and dispel, those ideas and address them. And I can say that, in our linguistics program, we're really very successful at developing that enthusiasm about the study of Caribbean Creole languages in our students. And that for many students, it has been quite liberating to understand that their first language is a complete language, that they have confidence in, having the knowledge of that language. So the areas that I have most studied, because of course linguistics is a very big field, people do specialize. So what I have mostly studied is different aspects of grammar, including reduplication, which is the topic for today. I've also studied some of the history of Caribbean Creole languages and the particular presence of African languages in the Caribbean, speakers of African languages in the Caribbean, who were really the people who formed these Creole languages in, the circumstances that we'd rather not think too deeply about. So those are the areas. And then the languages I've really focused on in my research include Berbice Dutch, which was formerly spoken on the Berbice River in Guyana, now extinct. Papiamento, which, as I said earlier, was a language I had learned before I studied linguistics. And of course, Jamaican Creole, having been here since 1991 with daily exposure to the language.
Yes, I can imagine. And as well, some of the points that you mentioned, that this is a real language. This is not just broken or Pig Latin, so to speak, what some people might want to refer to it as being. So, when we start, so in terms of would you be able to define reduplication?
Good. So reduplication is a word formation process. So if you think about words, we can divide words in words that are simple, they only contain one meaningful element, and words that are complex, they contain more than one meaningful element. So for instance, happy is a simple word, unhappy is a complex word, un is a prefix. It has an impact on the meaning. Happy is a stem. It can take that prefix, and the result is a related but different meaning. In this case, unhappy equates to not happy. So as a word formation process, reduplication creates complex words. So as an example, red denotes a color. Red now is a complex word because it contains two identical morphemes, two identical forms. And there is an impact on the meaning. Red now means, a deeper hue of red, more intense red. What sets reduplication apart from other word formation processes is that it makes use of the same form. So instead of the un plus happy, two different forms, red plus red, the same form. And interestingly, this, because it uses the same form, people think of it as an easy process, something that, not really worthy of deep study because look at it, it is so simple. Anybody can do this. As it turns out, when you start looking at reduplication in detail, it is not simple. There are so many shades of complexity that you can only reveal when you begin to study it. So we make a distinction between total reduplication, where you really just repeat the same form, and there already is a lot of complexity. But there are also reduplications that modify the form. So in Jamaican, apart from red, you can also do ready. So you'd have red, you've added E to it. Ready itself, in relation to the color, ready does not exist, right? But ready exists, and then it means reddish or red spotted. Not that intense red that you get from red, in quite the opposite. A little red here and there, a bleached out red. So now you have created a more complex form. You still have the complete red in there twice over, but now it has taken a modification. And the change in meaning is really quite, unexpected. Why is it unexpected? Because what we normally say is if you're repeating the same form, you expect to get more of the same thing. That's an expectation. And we capture that in what we call the iconic principle. And the iconic principle says more of the same form corresponds to more of the same meaning. So red does exactly what the iconic principle predicts. You get more of the form red, you also get more of the meaning that's associated with it. But in ready, you get the opposite. You get less of the meaning associated with red.
Thank you so much.
So that's a brief introduction. And I should say, by the way, I need to mention the name of Darlene La Charité because she was a colleague linguist who spent time in Jamaica. And it's when she was in Jamaica that we really started looking at this process. And we looked at it in Jamaican Creole. We looked at it in many Caribbean Creole languages. We also looked at Niger-Congo languages of the African continent to see how reduplications in Caribbean Creole languages might or might not correspond to those of the African languages that were, part of the input in the creation of Caribbean Creoles.
And we'll get to that shortly, but I wanted to ask as well, what were your 4 major findings regarding Caribbean Creole reduplication?
Right. So the first finding is how incredibly complex reduplication is when you start looking at it in detail. Not a simple process at all, not as easy as just stringing together 2 occurrences of the same form. That's one. Another major finding is that some types of reduplication are found across almost all Caribbean Creole languages. So the one where you take an attribute like red, or color, and you reduplicate it and you derive a more intense meaning. You pretty much find that all across the Caribbean. On the other hand, one where you take that same attribute and now you create a diminished meaning of it, like ready for reddish, that is found in several, but not all Caribbean Creole languages, right? Another major finding has to do with the historical changes in this process. So as an example, there are several reduplications in Jamaican where you take a verb, you reduplicate it, and what you get is a noun. And an example of that is what you scrape off the bottom of your pot. Don't know if you know that, right? You cook your rice and peas, and you have at the bottom of your pot, you have that which some people think is the best part of your rice and peas. And that's called crepe. And that's actually a noun. Whereas crepe, of course, is a verb meaning to scrape. So crepe is then the result of the scraping. Another result noun is itch. So you have a spot on your body somewhere that is bothering you and it's itching you and it is red and flaky and whatever. And that's an itch. And that's, again, it's a noun. Whereas itch is not a noun. Itch is a verb. That process, clearly worked historically to produce these forms, but is not productive in modern Jamaica. So you cannot take any verb, reduplicate it, and then derive a noun from it. It's only a handful of forms that do that. So historically, Caribbean Creole languages all have remnants like this that do not represent productive processes in the modern language. And finally, number 4, I went into the study of Caribbean Creole reduplication with the clear expectation that all these processes had African sources. And then I found that in a very general sense, that may be true because reduplication exists in West African and West Central African languages. But once you start looking at the details of the process, it's actually very hard to find the clear correspondence. And I'm going to give you one example that I found really unexpected. There's a major Nigerian group of languages called Igbo. And it's spoken inland Nigeria. And when I went through Igbo grammars, I didn't find anything useful on reduplication. But then I went through an Igbo dictionary. And suddenly I noticed verb reduplications where you have a verb, you reduplicate it, and you get a noun, specifically an instrument noun. So there are several Caribbean Creoles where we have reduplications of a verb that describes an activity that you carry out with an instrument, where you have instrument reduplications. So an example in Suriname, Tongo, Suriname, the verb for sweep is CB, and CCB, which repeats part of that verb, CCB, means broom. The broom is the instrument of sweeping. The verb for to brush is broshi. Brush is the brush itself. There is a verb tie, to tie up something, right? Tie. There is a related noun, tie, which is a form of reduplication, and it means string. String is what you use to tie up something. Historically, Jamaican Creole also has a noun, titay. If you look at the Dictionary of Jamaican English by Frederick Cassidy and Robert LePage, you can find it. It's a very old form. It's not, as far as I know, in modern usage, but it was historically attested in Jamaica. Now, Jamaica, of course, does not have CCB for broom. It has broom. And it does not have something like a reduplicated form of brush. It simply has a noun brush taken directly from English. So in Igbo, I found a potential source for this particular reduplication, which produces instrument nouns. So I had to dig through, dozens upon dozens of grammars and dictionaries to find that one possible source. And Igbo is an interesting source because we know that many Igbo speakers were trafficked by English slavers, that they did end up all over the Caribbean. But we do not see, for instance, large numbers of Igbo words in Caribbean Creole languages. So whatever impact Igbo speakers had, it seems to have been diminished by, other languages. But here is one thing that may have come from Igbo. We don't really know. And so that was that fourth finding. It's actually very difficult. In a general sense, you can say reduplication is all over West Africa. But when you look at specific types of reduplication, it can be actually pretty difficult to make a direct connection.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that leads me to my next question, which is, how does reduplication in Caribbean Creole languages reflect, these ancestral language patterns and family heritage?
Yeah. So ancestral language patterns, I would say, yes, there is that connection with West Africa. And that is also something we know because it does not really exist in European languages, right? In English, you can say, oh, that's very, very red. Okay, now, even in the way you say it, you know that if you were going to write this down, you would put a comma between very and the next very. Your intonation would separate the two. It's not one word. Whereas, of course, the reduplications in Caribbean Creoles, I started by defining it as a word formation process. The repeated form is one word, not two words. It's clearly different from repetition. So European languages do some amount of repetition. They don't like it a lot. Caribbean Creole languages have reduplication all over the place. It's clearly, a common process in Caribbean Creole languages. It is also common in West African languages. To me, that has to be the ancestral connection.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess, are there specific reduplication patterns that can be traced back to either Africa or Europe or indigenous linguistic influences within family histories?
Right. So there is a family of languages called the Be languages, GBE. Be languages are spoken in Togo and Benin. There is a particular type of reduplication where you can take a verb, reduplicate it, and what you derive is the result of, is an adjective, and it denotes the results. And I'm trying to think of a very quick example. For instance, beg. So beg is the verb, right? Okay. So you can call something beg if it has been obtained by begging, right? So that's an adjective noun attribute. So this beg pants, for instance. Okay, so you got these pants because you begged somebody for it. We found that type of reduplication is very uncommon in West Africa, but specifically occurs in Be languages. And so in the Caribbean, you find it to a degree in Jamaican Creole, not very common. Where you do find that it is very common, it's in the Suriname Creole languages. And in the Suriname Creole languages, you can actually take any verb, reduplicate it, and you get an adjective out of it that has this type of meaning, some kind of result interpretation.
Very interesting how it all kind of connects and how it all kind of comes out, I guess you can say, in the wash. So how has the use of reduplication been passed down through the generations within Caribbean families?
Right. Well, how do children learn language? Right? That is really what that question is about. So we have a whole field of study called acquisition, language acquisition. And we make a broad distinction between first language acquisition and second language acquisition. First language acquisition is the acquisition of the language spoken in the family and in the community. So this is the language that you learn in a very natural, intuitive way. You learn language without thinking about it as a child. Children who do not yet have the ability to throw a ball or, do anything that is cognitively a little more complex, like, do an addition, 2 plus 2 is 4. Children who do not yet have any of those abilities are already able to produce complex language. And they're certainly able to understand complex language even before they are able to produce it. So it's a natural process. I know that in the Caribbean, there is this idea that when you say first language, you must refer to the official language. No, that's not what it means in linguistics. Your first language is the language that you grow up with. Interestingly, in first language acquisition, we find that children go through predictable phases. So both in terms of, the word form itself, children start with this babbling phase, right? Dada, gaga, goo goo. That's not yet language. That's just sort of practicing sounds. And they can do a long stream of that. And it sounds like fluid, like they're doing it without any effort. Once they actually start to speak, then the fluency stops. Now they're struggling because now they become, they want to pronounce the word. And so, for instance, banana, they simplify into maybe nana. Okay. So they go through these stages. Also, how they treat grammatical processes, like how do you make a sentence into a negative? They start by putting no before the whole sentence. Then at some point, the no migrates into the sentence. Parents who try to actually correct their children will find that it doesn't work because the child will start to produce the adult structure once they're ready for it without correction. So that's first language acquisition. It's natural. And that is so the children through observation, which happens intuitively, will also acquire reduplication as a process that happens in their language. Mm-hmm. So just as they acquire, what is the word order of the language? How do you form a negative of a sentence? They will also, in the same way that they acquire that intuitive knowledge, they will acquire the intuitive knowledge about reduplication. As an adult, it's actually much harder to acquire these things intuitively because you've kind of gotten fixed into your first language knowledge. And now, whatever you try to acquire in the second language is going to be impacted by your first language.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I guess this goes into my next question. Like, do you see a difference in how older generations versus younger generations use reduplication in everyday speech?
Well, I can't speak specifically to reduplication, but I can speak more generally about changes in Jamaican Creole. Mm-hmm. So if you take the Dictionary of Jamaican English, which was compiled by Frederick Cassidy and Robert LePage based on the work that they did in Jamaica in the 1960s, they actually went all around Jamaica to document Jamaican Creole, to speak to people, to record people. When you look at that dictionary, you're going to see a lot of words that you don't know, that you don't recognize. And that's true for, anyone who grows up in Jamaica today. There's a lot of words in that dictionary that they will have never heard. For instance, there used to be many different words for cutlass. There are not that many different words for cutlass anymore. You have to look at the dictionary to get them. Okay, I don't have them in my head. There are not that many words for cutlass anymore. Firefly. There are still different words for firefly, but piniwali is becoming the word that everybody knows, whereas the other forms for firefly are just not so well known anymore. How does this happen? Well, one thing that allows for a language to be internally diverse is separation. So if you think about the geography of Jamaica, the Blue Mountains, the mountain range that runs across the spine, the foothills that separate the different bay areas, it used to be that people hardly left the area in which they were born. There was very little exposure to the form of Jamaican Creole spoken in other parishes because people did not move around much and they did not have the examples on media. The media were strictly in English, right? So all of that has changed. There's a lot more mobility. There's a lot more exposure through media where Jamaican Creole has become pretty commonplace. And now what you get is the impact of prestige. The Kingstonian form of Jamaican Creole is the prestigious form in Jamaica. And so a lot of people are sort of adapting their own language towards the Kingstonian form. So you get what we call dialect leveling. So a certain amount of diversity becomes less and less because people start to adopt another variety, another dialect of their own language. So the increased mobility is a great thing. The increased use of Jamaican Creole in the media is a wonderful thing, but it does then also mean that some amount of diversity in Jamaican Creole is disappearing. Another thing, of course, is that where practices disappear. That's the thing about the cutlass. If agriculture is no longer the dominant profession, even in many rural communities, then it also means that there is less exposure to the vocabulary that's associated with it. Mm-hmm. So that's how languages change over time. It's natural. And in the case of Jamaican Creole, it might be an advantage because there's a whole debate about standardization. And in a way, standardization is made easier when people speak more or less the same way.
Just less variety, that's all. And
yes.
Would there be any examples where, reduplication is used specifically within family settings, such as storytelling, nicknaming, or expressing affection?
Yeah, that's a good question. So although reduplication is a process that occurs in, everyday spoken Jamaican Creole, it's not as if every sentence is going to contain a reduplication, right? And it is perhaps the case that it might be more common in storytelling. But remember that reduplication is not just a form, it has a function. You reduplicate an adjective to increase the intensity of its meaning, red, yeah. Or your opposite to diminish it, to create ready for reddish. You reduplicate a verb to denote repeated occurrences. So for instance, thief means somebody stealing repeatedly. You reduplicate a noun to get several occurrences. So for instance, book, there's many books, maybe scattered books. So if you don't have the need to express the particular meaning that's associated with the reduplication, then obviously you're not going to get the reduplication. So reduplication is not, although everybody knows how to do it, it's not the case that every conversation necessarily is going to include a reduplication. It may or may not. It depends on the meaning that you're trying to express. And perhaps I should also make a point about that distinction between form and function. There are also forms that look reduplicated, but in fact, they are not. And an example of that is chaka chaka. There is no chaka, does not exist. Same for fanky fanky, there is no fanky, it does not exist. So these are forms that look like reduplications, but they are not derived through a word formation process, which means most likely that they were inherited directly from an African source. That is, to be identified. And I might refer to the work of one of my colleagues here, Joseph Farquharson, who actually did his research on African lexis in Jamaican Creole. And anyone who's interested in that topic can download his dissertation. So if you Google African lexis in Jamaican Creole, you will find his dissertation. And it includes this wonderful appendix of several hundred forms that he evaluates to see how best to attribute them to an African source. And he uses very strict criteria, which is important. Just because something resembles does not necessarily make it a source. So he really looks at both the resemblance in the form and that there is a resemblance in the meaning as well.
No, thank you. And I'll make sure that that is in the show notes as well, so people can be able to download that link. So what were some of your biggest challenges that you faced in studying reduplication across the different Creole languages?
Right. So for a linguist, there's always the question of how are you going to get your data and how do you know whether your data are complete? So just because your data do not contain a particular phenomenon is not necessarily evidence that it does not exist. It just means it's not in your data, but perhaps if you had looked somewhere else, you would have found it, right? So an example is all the data that I had access to when I was doing my joint work with Darlene La Charité. All the data we had access to on French Creoles suggested that French Creoles did not do verb reduplications. Well, it just so happened that it was not in the data sources, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because I have since spoken to colleagues who study French Creole. French Creole does also do verb reduplications. So, for instance, if I say walk, walk in Jamaican Creole, it means I'm walking up and down, right? So that's a verb reduplication. It answers to the iconic principle, more of the same meaning, more of the same form corresponds to more of the same meaning. Walk, and then walk, walk means you're doing more walking. Although there is a connotation of sort of aimlessness or pacing or up and down walking, right? There's a secondary connotation. Right. So we did a lot of consultation of sources, and we really tried to get our hands on any source that might give us good data. For Sranang Tongo, for instance, which is the main Creole language spoken in Suriname, I have this lovely autobiography by somebody who was a cultural icon in Suriname, Alex Dendry. He spoke his own autobiography, and then somebody wrote it out, typed it out, published it, entirely written in Sranang Tongo. Fortunately for me, I can read the language. And so that was a great source of reduplications in context, because you get text. So you don't just get an isolated form and somebody says, oh, this is X and this is what it means. No, you see it in the text and you can see the context and you can ascertain its meaning from the context. That's a wonderful data source. We don't have data sources like that for every language we look at. The other challenge was the African sources. And like I said, we ended up doing major research on reduplications in West African and West Central African languages. Again, you try to find every grammar, you try to find every dictionary. It's very labor intensive, but also, if you find what you're looking for, very rewarding. But we go back to that initial prejudice that, all you do is repeat the form. It's not interesting. So you see that the impact of that prejudice also in African language grammars. So a language might have this type of reduplication, but it's not described or discussed because it's thought that it is too simple to be of any interest. So it can be surprisingly hard to find the data when people have simply ignored it when they write their grammars because it didn't look interesting. So I think one of the things that work that I have done with Darlene La Charité, one of the things that is done is to actually bring it to the attention of linguists that so-called, easy total reduplication is actually not simple, is actually very interesting, actually reveals a lot about a language. And therefore, people pay more attention to it now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I guess, do you see any, parallels between Caribbean Creole reduplication and the reduplication in African or European languages?
Right. So as I said earlier, European languages really don't do reduplication. So to me, it is clear that the ultimate source has to be found in African languages, West African, West Central African languages. For some, we can point to a very specific source. For others, we can say this exists generally across languages in West Africa. And for others, we have to say it's not so easy to connect it to processes in West African languages, but the general pattern of reduplication is definitely West African.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And now, as we kind of come to a close here, with the migrations changing, especially around the world and especially within the Caribbean itself, do you foresee any changes in how reduplication is used as Caribbean Creole language continue to evolve in these multilingual societies?
That's such an interesting question. And I think, every language exists in different genres, right? You asked earlier about storytelling, for instance. Storytelling is a genre different from ordinary conversation. Ordinary conversation is a genre different from how you might use a language in a formal context. It's different. It could be different again from how a language is used in a church, for instance. So every language exists in different genres. You asked whether reduplication is more common in storytelling, which it might be. Nobody has really looked at that, right? That would be an interesting topic to look at. If storytelling becomes less common, then the particular way in which language is used in storytelling, that's something that children are then not really exposed to. And there might be particular idioms or particular formulaic expressions, or for instance, something like reduplication that's more common in storytelling, and that therefore becomes harder to learn if you lack that exposure. If you think, for instance, about what happens during Nine Nights. Mm-hmm. Nine Night used to be the context for storytelling. Now, what you get on Nine Nights is some towering speakers are set up in the yard, music blasts all night, nobody can tell stories in that environment, right? So that's a tradition that is becoming lost. And with that, there's a whole genre of use of language that people have less exposure to. And it's important, I think, that as we're looking towards the full development of Caribbean Creole languages into official languages, that we really try to preserve genre differentiation and cultivate it. You want to have a more literary, because that's what storytelling is, right? You want to have a more literary genre of the language. That becomes important as the language is expanded in different ways. So I hope that, in the whole discussion about standardization, that can also be a discussion about that, about how we preserve this internal diversity.
Absolutely. And I wanted to thank you so much for coming on and to speak about this, as this is, again, it's very integral. And I know a lot of people may not make that connection to know that, these languages are part of you. They are part of your identity and represent you in so many ways. So again, thank you so much for coming on and speaking about this, Sylvia. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Wendy, for providing me with this audience. I'm very enthusiastic about the study of Caribbean Creole languages, and I can tell people who think that these are simple language that they are not simple. They have their complexities. For me as a second language learner, I can tell you, I still do not fully understand all aspects of the grammar of Jamaican Creole. And so there's a rich area there for learning, for study. And I hope you will do more of these topics in your series. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.